expecting some of you have already planted you to give me a hard time. And this is, obviously a shorter version of a long paper, so I'll try to, if I've thought of something, I'll try to answer you, and if not, I will try to admit that I don't know. So we're thinking about inductive arguments for causal closure. There are deductive arguments, and I'm just going to ignore those. So suppose that all physical effects have physical causes. That means that the logical converse is true. No physical effects have non-physical causes. Let's call this claim causal closure. Causal closure is a significant idea. Many leading metaphysicians affirm it. And of course, we can sort of see that if causal closure is true, if all physical effects that have sufficient causes at all have sufficient physical causes, then several important truths would follow. For one, in the physical world, there's only one kind of cause. Physical causes, what Aristotle called efficient causation. Secondly, there's probably only one kind of stuff, physical stuff. Because even if other non-physical stuff exists, it is causally inert, so we can, for our purposes, ignore it. So that means immaterial gods do not turn water into wine. The universal beauty does not cause individuals to exemplify beauty, as Socrates thought. And non-physical souls do not exercise libertarian freedom. For instance, to attend, or perhaps, in most people's case, avoid philosophical conferences. We're all here, I think, due to our libertarian free will, but that would not be the correct explanation. The picture of the cosmos that I want to use on causal closure is an enormous mansion. And inside there's maybe chairs and bookshelves and a refrigerator. But the inside is an enormous Rube Goldberg machine. One of those machines where each effect is caused by a prior cause inside the house. There's no chains of effects inside the house that started outside the house. There's no light streaming in through the window and causing the surface of the book to warm up. It's heated from something else inside the house. Now, how exactly this premise, it's used as a premise in a physicalist argument, how exactly it's supposed to be formulated is quite tricky. For stated too strongly, it merely assumes physicalism, and stated too weakly, it can accommodate various forms of dualism. I'm going to just assume that it can be stated adequately without begging the question and look for some inductive arguments for it. Some leading philosophers simply assume causal closure. They treat believing causal closure as their sort of respectable thing to do, like locking your front door. You just do it, okay? It's not that there are no philosophers who disagree with it. Richard Swinburne, I don't know, he thinks that some physical effects have ultimately personal explanations. And Thomas Nagel thinks that some physical effects have ultimately teleological explanations. So is the case closed? One of my sort of concluding corollaries in this paper is that we need to change our rhetoric. So if you buy my arguments, what follows from that is that the rhetoric that's aimed at pliable undergraduates and the non-philosophical public suggests that, quote, we now know, unquote, the physical world is causally closed. We need to stop talking about it. So I'm not going to argue for supernaturalism or dualism or hylomorphism. I'm rather going to present 2 or 3 inductive arguments that are on your handouts in bold and show that they are inadequate. That means that the case is not closed. It, of course, doesn't mean that there are no other arguments. And it doesn't even really mean that the cosmos is open. It just means these arguments don't work. And so that means that philosophers who assume causal closure are doing that just assuming. They're supposing, like I asked you at the beginning to do, but it's not a sort of sine qua non of rational thought. And so I suggest that maybe there's a deeper motivation besides the evidence, the inductive evidence, for affirming causal closure, and that is a sort of physicalist propensity or disposition. So if by any miracle this is all clear, we can proceed to consider the first argument. What kind of argument can establish causal closure? The deductive arguments are notorious for restating their conclusion within the premises. And I can refer you to really good articles on that. An inductive argument, on the other hand, promises to cite neutral evidence that justifies belief in causal closure. Now, inductive generalizations, very briefly, take two steps. Gather into a class of phenomena, a sample, and identify the target property. The sample represents the whole population. If the target property exists in the sample, then probably, or to some degree of likelihood, it exists in the whole population. So of course, the most important feature of the sample is whether it's representative of the population. And my basic point is that it's going to be that these inductive arguments use radically insufficient samples. Andrew Melnick gives the first inductive argument there on your handout. The handout sort of marches down my argument with less detail, but I put the quotes in bold. Skipping the first sentence of the quote, contemporary physics has succeeded in finding sufficient physical causes for physical effects of very many kinds. It has found no physical effects at all for which it is necessary, or even likely to turn out to be necessary, to invoke non-physical causes. But current physics' success to date in finding that many physical events have sufficient physical causes provides inductive evidence that all physical events, including both unexamined physical events and examined but as yet unexplained physical events, have sufficient physical causes. So I think the thought's pretty straightforward. The target property is having a physical cause. We gather a sample, maybe the physicists have studied for the last 100 years and say, look, all these physical effects have a physical cause. Therefore, maybe all physical effects have a physical cause. I don't think this is very convincing, though. He could be saying three things. Is he just saying that physicists, who after all look for physical causes, by definition, have found them? Well, very well. Aristotle and Aquinas and Einstein would not take issue there. Is he saying that physicists could not at first find a physical cause, right? It seemed mysterious, but then they later found out there is a physical cause. Very well. A dualist or a hylomorphist or a supernaturalist can accept that there are things, you think you lost your keys because of a mischievous elf, and it turns out that you put them in a random spot. So a non-physicalist can accept that we were wrong with some putative non-physical ascription. So is he saying that physicists have currently found physical causes for all physical effects? No, of course not. He admits that we don't have physical explanations. That's that third category, examined but as yet unexplained. We might just think of the collapse of the wave function in quantum mechanics. In biology, the origin of the first eukaryotic cell is sort of like things. Emergence of first-person consciousness in psychology. So why would the crux of the issue, why would you think that one day there will be a physical cause for these physical effects? Why wouldn't you say, it's time to start looking for non-physical causes like formal causes for Aristotelian or personal explanations or teleological? Melnick has a hope beyond hope that all these physical events without physical explanations currently will turn out to be like those that we used to maybe ascribe to non-physical causes, but now we ascribe to physical causes. Well, Melnick doesn't give much of a reason for this belief. Instead, at the heart of his case is a bare assertion, and if you notice on the handout, it's tucked into the parentheses. He asserts that we have, and I'm paraphrasing now, found no physical effects for which it is likely to turn out to be necessary, that we need to invoke non-physical causes. That's exactly the question, is whether it will turn out to be necessary. So he gives us a suggestion of an inductive argument when he says, well, physicists are studying paradigmatically physical effects, and they all have physical causes. But the problem here is the sample. Are the few and narrow members of the sample of physical effects that physicists gathered in the last 100 years representative? If not, the generalization is hasty, and it's not representative. For one, physicists do not bother to study physical effects that seemingly do not have physical causes. They sort of assume, well, either it has a physical cause or it's outside the scope of my research. So if we're studying something crazy like dark matter, which is a hypothetical entity, then sure, a physicist would assume there's a physical cause for that. Let's go ahead and conduct our research on that assumption. But the assumption, notice, is just a restatement of causal closure. So the research that produces doesn't verify causal closure, it's amassed under the assumption of causal closure. If he says, I'm pretty sure there's no physical cause for that, I'm not going to worry about it, then of course a physicist wouldn't study it. So the sample that physicists, of all people, gather is not representative of what, say, a supernaturalist or a dualist would point to for all physical research. So Melnick seems to be saying, to use the mansion with the Rube Goldberg machine inside analogy, Melnick's saying, look, this is causing pressure on the table, and this paper, the light from the light is bouncing off here, therefore there's no oxygen seeping in through the door cracks, and there's no light streaming in through the windows. How does gathering samples inside the house tell us anything about what is or isn't outside the house? I don't see how that works. A slightly different argument from David Papanow. Papanow's article is really good. It's a kind of a tour de force through modern physics and the rise of naturalism, the rise of physicalism. He does give an argument for causal closure from the conservation of energy principle, but even he, and he's a physicalist, so I'm going off his authority, he says the conservation of energy principle is inductive. It's not as strong as the argument from physiology. Okay, so I'm ignoring the conservation of energy principle. He says in the recent research in physiology has given us reason to think that cosmos is causally closed. He says, quote, a great deal became known about biochemical and neurophysiological processes, especially at the level of the cell. And none of it gave any evidence for the existence of special forces not found elsewhere in nature. Though it has not always been so, there is now good reason to believe the empirical thesis that all physical effects are due to physical causes. It's going to be important for my critique that he thinks that it didn't used to be justified, but now it is to modern physiology. So Papanow's point is similar to Melnick, but I think he's emphasizing those, he talks about vital forces, which was the sort of live hypothesis in biology, that there was these vital forces that made things alive, I suppose. Turns out physiology has not discovered any evidence for these things, and so it's fallen out of fashion. And he says that's his sample, if you will. All these things we used to ascribe to esoteric forces that now we have physical processes to describe them. And then, of course, he generalizes that every physical process is like that, no matter how weird and wacky and mysterious it looks to us right now. Again, how does modern research giving us empirical data and detail about the physical processes going on in the body or in the brain supposed to generalize to there is no other kind of causation at play? Especially when you think about, for Aristotelian, efficient causation is always working, or can work hand in hand with formal causation and final causation. They're not overdetermined if they're different kinds of causes. So what about those phenomena that still, Thomas Nagel argues, are best explained? It's not that we don't have an explanation, it's that we currently have a better explanation of the development of life. It includes teleology. I think the picture for Papanow is persuasive because of an image. If you imagine, say, 100 unsolved physical mysteries, of which 98 have been solved in the last 150 years by a reductive physical science, then the last two, it looks like, we can call the case closed on those because science will out. But the imagination is false for two reasons. So his argument depends on saying we used to appeal to non-physical causes, but now we don't. Okay, but those are both false. Naturalists in the ancient world used to appeal to only physical causes. So Quentin Smith, in contrast to Papanow, in a very different article, is arguing that physicalism and causal closure was correct and was justified long before modern science. So he talks about Leucippus and Democritus, who knew that the universe was a causally deterministic, discrete sequence of atomic events, each of which has a sufficient cause of the prior state of the universe in conjunction with causal laws. So how do these guys know that the cosmos was causally closed, say to souls acting on your brain or your body, without the benefits of modern physiology? Papineau would have to say either they had a true belief, but it wasn't justified, or that they didn't have a true belief, which would sort of contradict his position, because he's not defended that his position is relevantly different metaphysically from Democritus. So I just sort of doubt the premise that modern physiology has given us that much new inductive data. But the second front attacks the notion that, quote, we now know that there are physical causes, that there's no such thing as vital forces or whatever. I'm not defending vital forces. I'm just saying that every dualist and supernaturalist and hylomorphist that defends that the soul is actually a cause of your brain activity or your body activity is exactly appealing to non-physical causes. So who's the we in that sentence? We now no longer appeal to, this is part of my complaint with your paper, which was very good, with the Q&A, I guess. We now use this criterion. Well, who's the we? Richard Swinburne doesn't. And certainly, he's no dummy. And of course, the we could include the people who do appeal to non-physical causes includes normal everyday folk who believe in souls and even superstitious folk, but also some philosophers and scientists. So I think, contrary to Papineau's historical account, which starts in the 1600s with Descartes and goes to the present day, Plato's description of this debate is more accurate. He calls it, and this is 2400 years ago, he calls it an ancient war between the gods and the giants. The materialists and the idealists have always been duking it out. And that just seems to be the picture. So the idea that a physicalist could say, physicalism is now true in a way that it wasn't when Democritus was arguing for it, because we know a lot of detail about the human body. Doesn't seem fun. So I'll have time for a third, very different argument from Jaguan Kim, and he offers what I assume some of you are thinking, which is not that causal closure is something that we can infer from looking at physical causes in a sample. It's something that we assume in our research, and since it works in our research, I wonder if you know that it works. Because it works in our research, maybe it's true. Right? So, inference is the best explanation. I assume A, and nothing runs afoul of my research, therefore A is probably true. That claim deserves a whole paper on its own. I would just offer one critique, which is that maybe assuming causal closure helps us to do very productive physical and physiological research because it allows us to focus on that one kind of cause, efficient causation, with almost a monomaniacal energy, and say, forget, just pretend there's no other kinds of causes in the whole universe. Let's learn about this one. And then guess what happens? We learn about that one. But it doesn't mean that there are no other kinds of causes. It was a methodological strategy. Just like a mathematician might, for the sake of his research, assume that there are no non-mathematical problems. Every problem has a mathematical solution. And they might become the best mathematician in decades. That doesn't mean that the question of how to be a good friend has a mathematical solution. So in short, the three inductive arguments I've considered are not talking about all causes, and so they can't generalize. They're not even trying to talk about all causes. The samples are no good. And so I want to offer one speculation and allow time for Q&A. If the inductive arguments are weak, and the inductive arguments I haven't dealt with, then it's sort of puzzling to me why causal closure has so many adherents and why it's put forward rhetorically as this do or die of rational thought. And so I'm wondering if adherents of causal closure owe their belief to not so much the inductive evidence, but a fundamental orientation. Papineau acknowledges this, but says that that's not the case. But when you look at from ancient times to modern times that there have been physicalists of this sort, they form a sort of club. And causal closure, in this case, becomes a banner under which to gather. Those who deny causal closure are not wrong, but they're outsiders from this physicalist club. And this is actually Alyssa Ney, who is a physicalist, actually argues this, so I'm not sort of trying to disparage it as saying it's not responsive to evidence. I'm saying, let's just call it what it is. And Alyssa Ney says the only way that physicalists can avoid Hempel's dilemma, which I can explain what that is if you like, the only way that they can avoid Hempel's dilemma is by treating physicalism not as a truth claim, but as an oath. or an attitude to follow physics in my ontology only, and follow in my ontology only where physics leads me. And I think that that's fine. That's fine to swear that out so far as it goes, but it should be acknowledged as such. So I've tried to consider 3 arguments for causal closure that are inductive. And my basic point in the first 2 has been that inductive argument's only as good as its sample. And the sample is almost by definition unrepresentative of all physical causes we might want to know all physical effects we might want to know the causes of. And so on the empirical evidence, we ought to be open to causal openness. That doesn't mean that it's irrational or something like that, or sub-rational to accept causal closure, but I would be interested if, in conversations with undecided undergraduates and undecided philosophers, it was presented more the way that it seems to me, which is something that people believe for the same reason they lock their door at night. They may have good reasons for it, but none of those reasons seem to be philosophical. Thank you.
Questions, of which I'm sure there's going to be many, starting with
Yes, so thanks very much for this interesting presentation. I have some couple of comments. And you have stressed often that these 3 arguments that you analyzed are inductive arguments.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they are. I think that they are more kind of, as you say in the case of the last argument, methodological constitutions, or what I would call hypotheses. I think they are more abductive arguments, following the terminology of Charles Peirce, American philosopher of the 19th century. And I think that causal closure, in a sense, is defining for science. I mean, scientists, when approach their work, find this assumption vital, because otherwise science could not exist as such. Because if you accept that you can,
at least so certain kinds of scientists, psychologists don't see it.
Oh, well, I'm not sure, but I mean, at least the 3 sciences that you mentioned, here, physics, biochemistry, and neuroscience, they do this, and I think this is vital for their own work. Sure. But I think this is, when I say that this is defining for science, I'm trying to say something quite strongly here. When Newton proposed his gravitational theory, the evidence at his disposal was quite tiny. Just the movement of a few planets and the simple observation that things on the Earth fall down. That's it. We didn't know about galaxies, clusters of galaxies, and all the phenomena that now, that gravitation could explain later on. But the importance of that proposal was its premise, its perspective. First of all, has an hypothesis that we should have put at the trial